So I'm Alisha Fredriksson, the co-founder and CEO of Seabound. We're a London-based climate tech startup that builds carbon capture equipment specifically for ships. So, there we go. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we've built Seabound so far, using more of a first principles approach, which I think is somewhat uncommon for the industry. My not-so-secret agenda in doing this is to hopefully help inspire many other climate tech solutions to be built over the coming months or years by demonstrating that you don't have to be an expert before you get started, and that there's an alternative approach you can take if you're up for the challenge. So, the problem that we set out to solve is that the shipping industry is a massive and growing source of CO2 emissions that's super hard to decarbonize. So if you take a look at one of these ships, sometimes they can carry up to 20,000 containers. They travel for up to 45 days at a time. And so they're carrying massive volumes of cargo over such long distances that we simply can't electrify that amount of energy that is required. And a lot of the future fuels that are being worked on, so things like methanol or ammonia, they just don't exist yet. So they're in development, but likely to take another 10 to 20 years to come into sufficient supply. This matters for the shipping industry and for our customers because there's brand new regulation that started about a month ago, which mandates that ships need to reduce emissions by about 40% by 2030. But there's no solutions yet, so no one is prepared for this. Before I started Seabound, I actually worked with another climate tech startup called Liquid Wind. And Liquid Wind makes fuel for ships out of captured CO2 and green hydrogen. Ironically, they didn't know where to get the CO2 from. It's actually very difficult to source it accessibly and affordably. And so our insight was, could we capture the CO2 from the ships themselves, sell that to a fuel company, use that to build up that fuel supply, and use that CO2 revenue stream to cover the cost of the technology in the first place? So this is what we wanted to explore. Notably, we were not experts in carbon capture. We didn't have PhDs in the subject. And neither my co-founder nor I are mechanical or chemical engineers. But we wanted to see if we could use first principles thinking to basically start with the problem, break it down, and then come up with a creative solution. And that's what I think first principles thinking means. This is opposed to the more traditional approach where you start with the solution, maybe you've come up with something in the lab or invented something through your PhD, and then you look for a problem that could solve. So we kind of took the opposite. What this entailed was researching all the different types of carbon capture technology to figure out what were the pros and cons, what did they look like, were they technologically mature enough to go, what would they cost, could they fit on a ship, and so on and so forth. We started speaking to customers, so specifically ship owners, to try to understand what challenges they had faced to reduce emissions on their fleet, and also what types of criteria they would use to evaluate new technology. Additionally, we looked at other attempts at ship-based carbon capture to figure out what was the hardest part about that problem. And then finally, we spoke to many experts along the way. What we found, firstly, as many of you might know, carbon capture takes place in two main steps. So the first step is that you bind the CO2 to some sort of a binding agent to capture it. And the second step is you regenerate the CO2 from that binding agent, usually by heating it up to separate them. So it's actually the second regeneration step that's the most complicated, the most costly, and the most energy intensive. And additionally, this process typically results in gaseous CO2, which you then need to compress and liquefy. And ports and ships, unfortunately, are not ready to deal with liquid CO2. We don't have liquid CO2 pipelines around the world, and so the ships would struggle if they were to arrive with it. So the solution we came up with was to take that process and basically cut it in half and then use solids to capture CO2 so that we wouldn't end up with this gaseous CO2 that we would then need to liquefy. Are you with me so far? Is this making sense? Cool. So the first step is the capture step, and this is what we do on board. We use a material called quicklime in pebble form to chemically react with the CO2 to turn into limestone. So basically, we make limestone on ships. And that's the only thing we do. We store it as rocks on board. When we get back to port, we could either sell the limestone to be used as a building material, and we skip that other complicated regeneration step, or we could do that step on shore, where we can build much larger regeneration facilities to service many different ships that are coming into that port, which reduces CapEx by about 90% compared to the competitive approach. And in this case, we would take the limestone, heat it up, separate the CO2 in quicklime, and then we could reuse the quicklime to capture more CO2 on another ship and sell the CO2 to a fuel company or to carbon credit buyers to then sequester underground. So when we came up with this approach, we reached out to a researcher that was essentially cited on every paper on this type of technology, and we've teamed up with him to co-develop it now. To give you a little bit of a quick history of our development timeline, so we started in October 2021. That's when we did that research phase and feasibility study. Then we built and tested a lab-based prototype about a year ago. And with that, we actually went out to raise our first round of seed funding. So we raised it from Y Combinator, Lower Carbon Capital, and others in the space of about $4.4 million. With that funding, we hired our core team of engineers. We now have engineering expertise in-house, and we built a second larger scale prototype. Currently, we're preparing for our first ship-based pilots. So we'll be doing our first relatively small scale system on board a ship this summer, and then our second much larger scale system at the end of this year. Finally, to give you a bit of a more tangible sense of what this looks like, this is our second relatively small land-based prototype. That's me pouring quicklime into the device. That's our team up in the corner. So there's only 6 of us so far, but we've been really busy to hit those targets. And then we actually sit in container ships. That's our office up in Tottenham. So finally, to close, I hope this helps demonstrate you can use first principles thinking to start with the problem, break it down, cut it in half, do what you need to do, and then build up a solution from scratch. Thank you.